A little boy without a home sings a lullaby on the street, catching the attention of a passing billionaire who recognizes the beautiful tune. Freeze and shock. It's the one his ex-girlfriend joyfully sang to their newborn. Hey there. Before we dive in, we'd love to hear from you in the comments about where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up to show your support. The channel is here for you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. Mason Sinclair stepped out of the towering glass skyscraper. Adjusting the cuffs of his coat danced in the brisk winter air, while the city buzzed with life. Taxis honking and people bustling about. Like clockwork, he heads down, eyes forward. Having just wrapped up another meeting. Exciting numbers projections suggest a merger is on the horizon, even if the details are starting to fade from his mind. Deals like this hold great potential. Routine life, in its polished and calculated way, has found a delightful rhythm. He walked toward his waiting car with a sense of purpose, feeling a gentle pull that encouraged him to take his time. A voice soft but steady, weaving through the sounds of the city, it was a child's. Voice raw with a kind of emotion that felt too powerful for a street corner. Mason turned his head with a sense of curiosity, searching for the source across the. A boy sat on the frozen pavement near a shuttered storefront, knees drawn up, wrapped tightly in a tattered jacket. Around his slender frame, his head tilted down slightly, brown curls playfully tousled, hands tucked beneath his arms. For warmth, but it wasn't the boy's appearance that captivated Mason. It was the peace sail. A lullaby familiar yet distant floated on the cold wind. The words embraced the air, weaving through time, gently guiding him back to a place he had once cherished. Olivia used to sing that song, whispering the melody into the warm glow of their cozy apartment, cradling a baby that hardly made a sound. A baby. Mason had never once held a baby that if the timeline seems to align with this boy's age, and though his chest tightened, there was a sense of something deeper at play. A conflict between logic and emotion that hinted at possibilities ahead. This city is filled with resilient kids finding their way and thriving despite the challenges they face. Could have originated from anywhere. Perhaps it was a delightful coincidence or just a figment of his imagination. He turned sharply, encouraging himself to walk away. His polished shoes clicking with purpose. Against the pavement, he had somewhere to be and something exciting to do. That boy was not his challenge, yet the song lingered with him, weaving itself into his thoughts long after he returned to his penthouse. That night he poured himself a drink, then another, gazing out at the skyline as memories joyfully resurfaced. He hadn't thought about Olivia in years, and he had allowed himself to believe she had left without a trace, without a word beyond the sharp. The quiet truth that she found difficult to accept was that he had let her go, and he hadn't fought for her. For her, it was important to fight for the child she carried. He should too. After a restless night, the next morning brought some challenges as he felt a bit irritable and snapped at others. Mason paused over something trivial before stepping into his car, where his driver eagerly awaited instructions. Instead of heading off, there was a moment of anticipation. Straight to the office. Mason found himself cheerfully muttering a different destination when he arrived at the street corner. The boy had moved on, leaving behind an empty spot where he once sat, filled only with the promise of new adventures. Just a few crumpled newspapers and a faint indentation on the sidewalk where he had been. It really shouldn't have mattered. Mason, ever observant, noticed his mood shift, which was an opportunity for growth rather than a loss. Mason exhaled sharply, expressing a sense of urgency. "I need you to find someone," he said, determined to make it happen. He just nodded, phone already in hand. He had been with Mason long enough to know what to expect. By the end of the day, he had discovered the answer, the boy's name, showing that sometimes patience leads to wonderful revelations. Justin had been navigating life on the streets for a while, exploring different shelters along the way. Always on the move, his mother Olivia had passed away last year, but he carries her memory with him wherever he goes. Mason gazed at the information in front of him, contemplating the known relatives, feeling a sense of possibility in the air. Of him, the words blurring slightly, she was gone just like that, leaving behind a sense of possibility in the air. No confrontation, just a departure. And the child he had yet to meet, one he had so effortlessly let go, was out there thriving on. Only remnants in the street smarts he had gathered throughout his journey. A challenging sword of guilt nestled deep within. Mason's stomach felt heavy and unshakable. Yet he had spent years believing in himself that Everything he had chosen and Olivia had chosen brought them to this moment, and that was what truly counted. The life she had built wherever she had gone was no longer his concern, but it was still a part of her journey. There was a boy out there with endless possibilities. A boy who? He had no idea that the man who had walked past him yesterday, the man who had simply looked away, was actually the same man who had once let go of the opportunity to be his father. Mason set the file down. Jaw tightening, he was determined not to look away again. Mason hadn't slept. He had spent most of the night in his study. Eagerly going through the file Mason had put together, revisiting the same lines with a sense of determination, and over as if they transform. As if ink could shift and convey this to him. It felt like a dream that Olivia was still here, that the boy on the street was truly his son, had been left behind before he ever had the opportunity to truly know him, yet the words remained constant, strong, and unwavering. And by that, as the sky began its beautiful transition from black to gray, a new reality emerged, bringing with it a sense of depth and understanding that he couldn't ignore. Shaky had never once searched for them, not when Olivia left, not in the years that followed brought a sense of ease in letting them fade, allowing him to reassure himself that their success was not his concern. Moving forward without him, he had created a whole life based on that illusion. But now the reality was, sitting in front of him, it was clear that his son was resilient, making the best of whatever came his way, scraps he could find. And Mason had not intervened at all by the time morning arrived. Mason had already made up his mind and tracked just into a soup kitchen a few blocks from where he had first seen. The place was tucked between buildings, and its entrance was easy to miss if Mason stood outside a bit longer than he intended, observing as people flowed in, and he bundled up against the cold. And with each passing moment, he began to feel a sense of anticipation, as if something wonderful might happen at any moment. Had dedicated years to negotiating deals with determined individuals, making decisions that transformed entire industries, and yet here, he paused at the door of a soup kitchen, gathering his courage, and then stepped inside. The place was warm, the air filled with the comforting aroma of broth and coffee as volunteers cheerfully moved behind long tables, handing out plates. Their voices created gentle hum beneath the scrape of utensils and soft whispers. Mason scanned the room, and his eyes brightened as they landed on a familiar mess of curls near the back. There was Justin, sitting alone, at a small table, leaning over a bowl, joyfully tearing a piece of bread into small bites before dipping it into the soup. His coat, though a bit thin for the weather, had a unique charm in the light. It was a testament to resilience, even if it was barely holding on. Together, the fabric frayed at the seams. He moved with a keen awareness that blossomed from experience, glancing up every so often, as if anticipating challenges. Having learned long ago that the world could be unpredictable, Mason approached slowly, pulling out the chair across from him with a friendly demeanor, while Justin barely glanced up. His expression was a mystery as he took another bite. "You following me or something?" The words felt light and easy, but there was a little surprise beneath them as Mason set a paper bag on the table, sliding it toward him. It seemed like just the thing to brighten his day, something better than soup. Justin eyed the bag, then him, one brow lifting slightly. "What do you think? Just 'cause you wear a fancy coat, you can drop food in front of some kid and feel great about yourself." Mason exhaled, pressing on. With his lips pressed together, he found it surprising to be brushed off so quickly. "He just thought you might appreciate a nice meal." Justin leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the table. "And what do you?" Mason paused for a moment, then shrugged. It was nothing, really. Justin didn't seem to mind. Convinced, he pulled the bag closer. But instead of opening it, he set it aside with a sense of possibility. "Hey, I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to earn my way. If you're seeking to help someone, there are plenty of others who might need it more." Else, Mason could have anticipated the resistance, yet it still caught him off guard. Most kids in his position would have taken the food without question, but Justin was unique. There was something in the way he carried himself, the way he observed others, always seeming to be 2 steps ahead. "Fair enough," Mason said, leaning back slightly. "How about a deal then?" Justin smirked, amused yet intrigued. Excited. "Oh, this is going to be great. You take the food, and in return, you share a." Justin studied him for a long moment before shaking his head with a light-hearted laugh. "Yeah, no thanks. Mason chose not to press for interviews. Instead, he nodded toward the soup with a sense of understanding. Do you come here often? Are you planning to start showing up every day now? Mason tilted his head, curious about Justin. Gave him a long look filled with curiosity before finally opening the bag, and the delightful aroma of fresh warm food filled the space between them and with a newfound curiosity. Justin's fingers twitched slightly as he pulled out the sandwich inside. They took a careful bite, as if savoring something precious. They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the lively sounds of the soup kitchen. As he moved around them, Justin eventually spoke, his voice softer than before. Mom used to come here before she got too sick. And Mason maintained a calm expression, but the words resonated more deeply than he anticipated. He had already known Olivia had been unwell, but hearing it from Justin brought a new perspective. Turned it into something tangible in a way that no file ever could. She always encouraged me, Justin. He expressed that it was a great opportunity to figure things out on my own. And with determination, he tore off a piece of the sandwich, eyes flickering toward the volunteers. They're really nice here. Mason felt a spark of curiosity and wanted to ask more. But he wisely chose to hold back. Instead, he allowed Justin to take the lead in the conversation, giving him the opportunity to choose what to share. They discussed the soup kitchen, discussing the most wonderful spots to rest when the shelters were at capacity and how he could identify those who were genuinely willing to lend a hand. It seems like some people were just putting on a show of caring. But it's interesting that Justin didn't bring up his father. For now, let's focus on Mason. He thought he was just another stranger. Later, after Justin had gone, Mason he organized a special call to arrange for additional food to be sent to the soup kitchen, bringing hope and nourishment to those in need. Nearby, to keep the bed ready for an envelope of money to be tucked into Justin's belongings, he told himself it was simply a precaution, just in case Mason walked in the next morning. Mason's office, a sealed envelope landed on his desk. You'll want to see this. Mason opened it, and inside was Mason ensured that every bill was untouched, leaving money arranged for Justin. Mason let out a low whistle as he stared at the envelope for a long moment, while the kids cried around him. Before setting it aside, let's find out where he's staying. Mason hesitated. But are you sure? Mason took a moment to gather his thoughts. He was contemplating everything with an open mind. Mason realized that Justin was out there alone, and for the first time in his life, he felt determined to stand by him. Had anticipated some resistance, but he was surprised by the remarkable level of stubbornness Justin displayed. The kid had pride, keen survival instinct, and a strong sense of caution that influenced every interaction. The returned money had been evidence that he was self-reliant and not in search of rescuers. Mason had successfully tracked Justin's usual movements as he navigated between shelters and soup kitchens, looking for another way in. And on nights when everything was full, there was a hidden spot near an old construction site where he found comfort sleeping under a collapsed structure. Scaffolding was challenging, but he found a way to make it work. Mason had the option to pay for help, but he embraced the challenge. He found a permanent shelter, pulled some strings, and made a few calls, and that was just the beginning. Mason decided that since Justin wouldn't take something for nothing, they could find a way to make it work together. To inspire him to seize the opportunity the next time he encountered Justin. It was no coincidence that he discovered him sitting near a charming little bookstore, observing the lively crowd. He walked by with his hands tucked into the pockets of his thin coat, exuding a sense of quiet confidence rather than desperation. With a keen eye, as if anticipating the perfect chance that others overlooked, Mason took a seat beside. Without saying a word, Justin shot him an unimpressed glance. Are you following me now? He thought. Mason mentioned that he thought he would explore a business opportunity, while Justin reacted with a scoff. What, you want me to shine your shoes or something? No. But I could definitely use someone to help run errands for one of my offices. It's all straightforward. Just pick up deliveries and keep everything stocked. I can pay in food since I understand your concerns. Money. Justin studied him, the gears turning in his head, and he embraced it. He was finally considering it, and with a slow nod, he said, Fine. But if this is some rich guy guilt thing, I'm out. Mason smirked. I wouldn't dream of it. The first few days were challenging. But Justin approached the pristine glass building with a sense of curiosity, eager to explore every detail. An exceptionally courteous employee approached the situation with caution. anticipating a hidden agenda and prepared to make a swift exit at the first hint of trouble. Challenges, but Mason allowed him to work at his own pace. And Mason, who embraced the entire experience. Incredibly fun, made sure to engage with the kids who showed such bravery, Mason remarked one afternoon after Justin had shared his candid thoughts on Mason's office. He remarked that your desk looks like it belongs to a guy who doesn't seem to do any work. But Mason acknowledged that Justin quickly stepped in, himself comfortable, perhaps a bit too comfortable, especially with Mason's laughter echoing around. He enjoyed playfully teasing Mason about his pricey suit choices, his overly intricate coffee order, or the fact his office was filled with an abundance of finance books. And while they may not have been the most thrilling reads, he'd stroll into meetings with a snack in hand, ready to tackle whatever came his way. From the conference table, employees left with a mix of confusion and amusement, captivated by the shark's presence. Tong, the kid who showed up like he owned the place, made a great impression on Mason. It was the first. It's been years since someone had the courage to call him out, and it wasn't just the attitude. It was the way Justin carried himself. With a keen eye, he navigated the world, assessing everything as if he were already 10 steps ahead. He noticed angles that others overlooked, people quicker than many adults. Mason understood it because he had once been that way too. But what truly resonated with him was the moment he spotted Justin lingering near the office bookshelf. It was clear that the finance books weren't the only thing drawing his interest. It was a well-loved copy of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn tucked between them. Mason hadn't touched it in years, but Justin reached for it, his fingers lightly brushing the spine before he quickly pulled his hand back, as if he had just realized the thrill of a secret adventure. Mason asked casually if Justin liked books. Justin shrugged and replied, "Not really." The next. What a delightful surprise. A new book was waiting on the break room table, just like that. Justin didn't acknowledge it. But by the end of the day, it was gone, and things were looking up for Mason. Was beginning to sense that he was truly making strides, as if this could be the path forward. But then everything took a turn. One evening, Justin didn't show up for his usual shift, and Mason mentioned it himself, not to overthink it. But as the hours ticked by, a sense of anticipation settled deep in his chest when Mason finally called with an update. His voice was tense. "I found him," Mason said. "It's bad." Mason was already out the door before Mason could finish. When he arrived, Justin was leaning against the side of a building, showing signs of resilience despite the bruises blooming across his face. One arm curled protectively around his ribs, his clothes. Mason crouched beside him, his voice filled with concern as he noticed the usual signs of distress, with lips split and more torn than ever. It was a bit tight, but Justin waved him off with a weak smile. Mason felt a surge of determination as he noticed Justin let out a dry response. "Some guys at the shelter had their opinions about me taking more than my share, but that's just part of the journey. Share more than a share." The words made Mason's stomach turn. Justin had likely. Mason had taken an extra meal and maybe an extra blanket, and for that, he faced a tough situation, but he remained resilient and hopeful. He happily scooped Justin up before the kid could protest and carried him straight to his car. Justin groaned but didn't resist. He had the strength to fight him off at the private clinic, where the doctor patched him up while muttering something about age. Mason pushed aside the frustration that bubbled up, reminding himself that this wasn't the first time he'd faced challenges. He remained by Justin's side, patiently waiting and watching as the kids peacefully slept. The pain hours later, when Justin finally stirred, his voice was hoarse, but he assured everyone, "I'm fine. You can relax now, Mason. You're in a safe place." Justin's expression shifted as he sat up slowly, emphasizing that there was a path forward. Mason exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face, feeling a mix of emotions. "I can't do this, Justin. I can't just sit back and watch you get hurt, especially not when." Dash paused, and Justin noticed the moment of uncertainty in his weary demeanor. Eyes narrowed, not when Mason hesitated. He had planned to wait to ease into it to allow Justin the opportunity to build trust. Yet the truth was becoming increasingly important. Feeling overwhelmed, he looked at the kid who appeared battered and broken, and it sparked a determination within him. He met Justin's gaze with renewed resolve, and spoke the words before he could hold them back, "Because I'm your father." Silence. Justin stared at him unblinking. Then he burst into a short, surprised laugh. "That's amusing." You really had me there for a moment. Mason didn't budge, and I'm serious. Justin's expression shifted, the exhaustion, the guarded amusement. Everything faded away until all that remained was clarity. Was left in a moment of stillness. He looked at Mason as if he were discovering him anew. It was the first time. And although what he saw wasn't ideal, Mason prepared himself for what was to come. There was a mix of emotions, but Justin simply shook his head and moved forward. Himself off the bed. I'm leaving. You're going to feel better soon. Dash. I don't care. Mason reached for him, but Justin pulled away. His voice was. It was quiet, yet it sliced through the air with precision. Where were you? Mason's throat? Justin chuckled, feeling a mix of uncertainty and determination as he took a careful step forward. Toward the door, Mason stood still, watching him go, sensing a shift within. Deep inside him, he had finally shared the truth, and in that moment, he had let go. Once more, Mason stood still, observing Justin as he exited the clinic, feeling the significance of the moment. His own words lingered in the air, and he had anticipated anger, preparing himself for it. Questions, accusations, but he was surprised by the calm, vacant expression that had taken over Justin's face before he turned away. It felt even more challenging than shouting, more intense than the sharp edge of. It was the look of someone who had spent his whole life hearing promises, yet remained hopeful and ready to embrace new possibilities. Now he encouraged his legs to move, catching up just as Justin confidently pushed the clinic door open and stepped into the. Despite the cold, Justin pressed on. His steps unsteady yet filled with determination. You're doing great, and it's important to focus on what you can control. Just keep pushing forward and make the most of the situation. Something tightened in his chest, and yes, it was that which stopped Justin. He turned, laughter bubbling up, breaking out of him, sharp and humorless. Since when? Since 5 minutes ago. When you? He chose to share with me, shaking his head, revealing a hint of something deeper in his eyes. Mason took a step closer, being mindful not to push too hard. I wish I had shared this with you earlier. I should have, and Dash should have too, but Justin interrupted. You could have looked for me. You could have been there. But it seems that wasn't the case. Chuckled while shaking his head. It's quite amusing, really. You're out here investing money. It feels as though it has the power to mend everything. To compensate for the times you weren't present when my mom was unwell. Needed help when I needed help. His voice cracked just slightly, and he swallowed with determination. It's challenging to push it back down, so why now? Why do you suddenly care? Mason felt the words caught in his throat. There was no excuse, no answer that could mend what had happened. It had already been broken, but Justin truly deserved the truth because I was hesitant. I acknowledge that I made a mistake when I cheated on your mother, which led to her leaving. I am here to take responsibility for my actions. Let her know I didn't fight for her for you. I convinced myself it was for the best. She'll find her happiness, and I chose to let her go. I didn't pursue her. I should have. His voice was quieter now, steady and strong despite the weight in his chest. But I didn't. Justin stared at him. His body tense as if he was ready to spring into action, but he found it hard to move. But that's okay. His voice was hoarse, and he decided to take a break. Let her leave. And I never even thought to check if we were okay. I thought about it every day, Justin. Let out a steady breath, his hands forming into determined fists. Well, guess what? Thinking. It was a challenging time for her in that rundown apartment, and I felt the weight of it when I had to be there with her. Observing the moment, his breathing became a bit uneven, and his voice carried a new intensity as he reflected. About it doesn't mean anything. Mason reached out, but Justin stepped back sharply. Don't, Justin. He shook his head, his voice rising. You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up. Now, just act like you care, as if it makes a difference. You were a bit late. He has moved on, walking away with determination this time. His shoulders set. Just stay out of my life. Mason's post echoed in his ears as he took a step forward, but Justin was already sprinting ahead. He called after him, but Justin moved forward. The boy disappearing into the vibrant streets, embraced by the bustling city. And Mason felt something inside him sink lower than it ever had before. But he knew that every ending brings a new beginning, and he would find his way back again. Life presented challenges, but he knew that new opportunities were just around the corner, waiting for him to seize them. He had no money to throw at the problem, but he was determined to find a solution he could create with his efforts. His entire career fixing things, building an empire on the idea that there was always a way forward, and this was just another challenge to overcome. Contract. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a 17-year journey that no amount of wealth has the potential to bring about change. Mason reached out 3 times that night, but he didn't respond. Instead, he returned to the place where he had first seen Justin, that special spot, where the boy had sat on the frozen pavement singing the lullaby that had changed everything. He stood there as the rain began to fall, brisk and steady, drenching his expensive coat as he embraced the moment. He waited, feeling a sense of anticipation. It could have been an hour or maybe even more. But the cars splashed past with their bright headlights, creating a lively scene around him, cutting through the downpour, but Justin never appeared. The city moved on around him, full of life and energy. Mason stayed until his hands were stiff with cold, but then the rain seeped through every layer of fabric, transforming the scene as the street emptied and silence stretched long into the night, yet Justin never came. Eventually, he turned away, his footsteps steady as he walked back toward the car, rainwater glistening in his hair. He had spent years reassuring himself that it was all inconsequential, that Olivia and the child she had taken with her were simply part of a larger journey. Then echoes of a past he had moved on from, now standing on a vibrant street filled with possibilities. In the middle of the night, he discovered the truth. He had always held on to hope, waiting for them to return. Mason. I struggled to sleep, and each hour that went by without any sign of Justin felt like a challenge, a chance to reflect on my journey. How much time he had already lost. Days slipped by, and the streets held endless possibilities. Answers. The kid had disappeared like a wisp of smoke, as if he had never been there at all. Mason and a dedicated security team were enthusiastically searching the city, exploring shelters, hospitals, and even soup kitchens. Justin had once been a regular, but the streets had a way of embracing people, especially kids who understood how to disappear, and Justin had been thriving on them for years. Mason tried to reason with him, expressing that they had done everything possible and that Justin would show up when he was ready, but Mason couldn't let go. He hardly touched his food and spent most of his time pacing with his phone, always holding his hand. He answered before the first tone had even finished, eager to see what awaited him. Mason suggested taking a break after the 3rd sleepless night, saying, "You're going in circles, Mason." He hardly glanced away from his phone, "But I've already found my way back once, and I'm determined to do it again." Once more, Mason let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "I understand, but you really don't." Mason's voice was sharper than he intended, but he embraced it with confidence. Feeling tired, a bit upset, and hard on himself more than anyone else, it's tough to understand what it's like. It's amazing to think about having a child out there and the possibilities that could have unfolded. I realize now how many times I could have reached out and connected. Olivia made an effort to mend what I had broken, but I couldn't, and now she's moved on, along with Dash. He paused, shaking his head. I won't lose him too. Mason didn't. He simply nodded and returned to his phone, making more calls and reaching out. As they reached out to more contacts, the search continued with determination, and on the 5th day, they finally received the breakthrough they had been hoping for. A street vendor near an abandoned construction site recognized Justin's description, marking their first real lead. He spotted the kid a couple of nights ago, and it seemed like he was trying to keep a low profile. He didn't stay long, but Mason was optimistic about the encounter. Already out the door before Moss could finish the sentence, the warehouse was just what Mason had hoped for. Weathered metal beams standing at an angle, broken windows creating an intriguing view. It must have once been a storage facility that once thrived, now a hidden gem waiting for someone to discover its potential. Mason stepped inside with caution, the floors scattered with old debris, the air filled with a damp scent that hinted at hidden stories waiting to be uncovered. Despite the mildew and rust, the light from outside was just beginning to peek past the entrance. Leaving the corners thick with shadows, he briefly considered that the vendor might have been mistaken, but then, in the farthest corner, something caught his eye. Just a hint of something intriguing beneath a pile of old blankets and newspapers, waiting to be discovered. Movement made Mason's chest tighten as he noticed Justin curled up on the floor, his small frame tucked in tightly. Frame trembling, his breath coming in uneven bursts. Even from afar it was evident that something was amiss with his usual sharpness, quick wit, and determination. Defiance had faded. and he appeared delicate in a way that Mason wasn't quite ready for. Crouched down, voice low, Justin waited for a response. Mason reached out, pressing a hand to the boy's forehead. Heat radiated off him in waves. "Justin, wake up." The boy stirred slightly, his lashes fluttering, his breath a bit uneven, his face full of potential, filled with uncertainty. His voice was barely a whisper, but Mason didn't hesitate. Scooped him up, brushing aside the feeble protest as Justin attempted to push him away. "Put me down," Justin slurred. Fingers gently clutching Mason's sleeve, Justin's thoughts swirling with possibilities. Resting against his chest, his struggle gently fading. He feels confident he can manage on his own. Mason tightened his grip, ready for what was to come, as he waited outside, holding the anticipation in his hands. The door swung open just as Mason approached, and Justin hardly moved as Mason slipped inside. In the back seat, he held the kid close as they sped off toward the clinic. Mason glanced back, hopeful that the fever would soon be under control. Mason shifted slightly, adjusting Justin's weight as he worked through the challenge ahead. By the time they reached the clinic, Mason had nothing more to add, and Justin was feeling hopeful. With a sense of urgency, the doctors swiftly moved him onto the stretcher, checking his vitals as Mason stood nearby. Hopeful for a positive outcome. The side hands were clenched, observing the hard work being done, and one of them felt a bit tired. Finally said, glancing over, "His body has been through a lot of stress, but there's hope for recovery. Hasn't eaten properly in days, but the fever is likely to break once we get some fluids in." And Mason nodded with determination. "What can we do in the meantime?" "Let him rest, then. So, let's make the most of this moment." Mason sat beside the hospital bed, arms crossed, observing the scene with a hopeful gaze. The gentle rise and fall of Justin's chest, the way his fingers twitched slightly even in sleep, as if he was always ready for something wonderful. After some hours had passed, Justin stirred, his brow slightly furrowed. Gently his body shifted under the blankets, and then his eyes opened just. He was just starting to realize where he was. His voice a bit hoarse. "I reminded you not to follow." Mason exhaled, releasing the tension in his shoulders and finally feeling at ease. "You have so much to say." Of things, Justin let out a soft sound that could have been a laugh or perhaps just a breath. Either way, it was something. Mason leaned back slightly. Observing him filled me with a sense of wonder. "You know." Justin blinked slowly, as if processing that. It seems shrugged didn't have it in mind. "Well, here we are." Silence settled between them, heavy yet softer than before. Justin shifted under the blanket, shifting a bit. "I'm feeling a bit upset with you, but I think another pause might help." It was a bit softer this time, almost with a hint of reluctance. "Thanks for coming." Mason didn't say anything, just nodded as Justin closed his eyes once more, feeling the gentle embrace of exhaustion guiding him into a peaceful rest. He embraced sleep this time, not flinching at all when Mason gently pulled the blanket higher around his shoulders. For the first time in days, Mason embraced the moment. Breathe, he was here to stay. Mason made sure Justin understood there was no other option after the fever broke, and the doctor gave him the all-clear. He had him in the car before the kid could even think of a good excuse. Justin may have felt overwhelmed, but that didn't stop him from expressing his thoughts along the journey. "I don't need a babysitter," he said with a hint of determination. Arms crossed as he settled into the passenger seat, feeling optimistic. Mason reminded everyone to keep their eyes on the road, while Justin let out a huff but chose not to respond. He had the energy for a real fight, even though he was still pale and his body felt drained from the amidst days of exhaustion and sickness. Mason caught him stealing a hopeful glance at the window, watching the city joyfully blur past. Minutes later, they arrived in front of Mason's building, and Justin stepped out with a steady expression, ready for what lay ahead. Mason could sense the change in his posture as he admired the towering structure of glass and steel. The doorman welcomed them with a warm smile, opening the lobby doors with ease. Justin remained calm, but as they stepped inside, a sense of excitement filled the air. His head tilted slightly upward, taking in the beauty of the marble floors and the grandeur of the high ceilings. Massive chandelier, he let out a slow breath. This seems promising. Mason's enthusiasm led him to the elevator, eagerly pressing the button for the top floor. Justin leaned against the railing as the doors slid shut, feeling a sense of familiarity wash over him. The penthouse was just as quiet as Mason had left it, a serene stillness that felt almost peaceful. Silence enveloped the space, creating an intriguing atmosphere even with someone present. Justin stepped in cautiously, his eyes darting around with curiosity. Surround the expansive open area, appreciating the contemporary furnishings, the sleep kitchen, and the floor-to-ceiling windows that. After a moment, he turned back to Mason with a serious expression, saying, "So do rich people seem to overlook the ordinary things around them. Where's the TV? Where's the clutter? This is interesting. It feels like a showroom," as Mason shrugged, tossing his keys onto the counter with a sense of ease. Justin cheerfully wandered toward the kitchen, taking a quick peek inside the fridge before moving on. Mason frowned and let out a snort as Justin grabbed a bottle of mineral water held high, showcasing the fancy options available. Though it seems there's no food to accompany the delightful drinks. Snacks are just delightful indulgences. Mason crossed his arms, ready to place his order. "Of course you do." Justin shook his head and shut the fridge. "You really?" Mason didn't answer right away. It had always been a space waiting for something more, just another place to explore. There's a fascinating journey in the space between my meetings, where another asset he owned reflects the years he dedicated to collecting wealth and building businesses, expanding his reach. And as he looked around, he noticed the potential for growth. Justin stretched his arms with a Winston looked around again, curious about where his room was. Mason gestured toward it. The guest wing down the hall, first door on the left. Justin happily complied, nodded and shuffled off, clearly too exhausted to care. For the first few days, things were tense. But Justin didn't let that get him down. Trust the space, he walked with a sense of anticipation, as if he was ready for a surprise. He flinched every time Mason spoke to him. But there was a spark of hope in the air. He was simply present, not seeking anything in return, and graciously accepted whatever was offered to him. In front of him, using only what he had. Mason had filled the kitchen with real food, only to discover Justin is being careful about touching anything unless Mason gives him the go-ahead. Mason chose to switch things up one night and enthusiastically pulled Justin into the kitchen. Rolling up his sleeves, he said, "Come on. If you don't like the food situation, let's make it better." Justin raised a brow. "You're going to cook? That sounds exciting." Mason smirked. "Watch and learn." It turned out that Justin had a bit less than expected. Patience for the wealthy gentleman navigating the kitchen, he playfully teased Mason as he tackled simple tasks, muttering along the way, "It looks like you're really focused with that knife." And I've noticed. It took a little longer than expected, but the toddler cracked the eggs quite well in the end, achieving a half-decent result. Meal. And that was the first night Mason noticed a change in Justin that was truly exciting. He had a wonderful time, relaxed, let his guard down, and even laughed, really laughed. It was the first time. The tension between them felt more like a bridge. After that, the rhythm between them transformed. Justin now embraced it. Stronger embraced the opportunity to highlight every quirky aspect of Mason's lifestyle, playfully teasing the smart home system. Why rely on AI to turn on your lights? Surely, your hands can do the job. How much did you pay for this couch? It could be more comfortable. And the private gym Mason never used. I'd sell this entire room for a burger and feel so much happier. Mason thought to his own surprise. Found himself truly enjoying it. The kid had a remarkable ability to cut through all the nonsense and make Mason see things differently. Own life and see how amusing it all was, and then one night it happened. Mason was in his office organizing paperwork when he caught a faint sound coming from the living room. With a soft yet familiar melody, the lullaby played as he hesitated, then stepped out with a sense of purpose. Stopping in the hallway just out of sight, Justin was sitting on the couch, curled up with one of the books, completely absorbed in his reading. Mason had left out for him. Humming cheerfully as he flipped through the pages he probably didn't even. Mason realized he was doing it, and he swallowed something that caught in his throat without hesitation. As he leaned against the wall, he softly joined in, creating a moment of connection. Justin paused for a brief second, the humming coming to a gentle halt. Then, after a moment, he continued with a steady voice, and they joyfully hummed the rest of the song together, either looking at the other, either acknowledging it. But when it ended, something felt uniquely different. Night enveloped Mason as he sat in his study, long after Justin had drifted off to sleep, gazing out at the skyline he had cherished throughout his life, embracing the idea of being a father, welcoming responsibility, and finding strength in what he had lost. even if it felt challenging. Just support Justin. He wanted to be a father, and the lullaby stayed with Mason. Long after that night, it wove itself into his thoughts during moments of quiet. He chose not to bring it up, and neither did others. Justin, but something between them had changed. The walls weren't as thick. The silence between them was now light and free, no longer burdened by resentment. It wasn't perfect, but Justin still had his sharp tongue. Independent to a fault, still had moments where he kept his distance, yet the tension that had once defined there. Mason began to notice small signs of trust emerging in every interaction, where there had previously been none before Justin. He confidently took food from the fridge, no longer lingering by the door as if he was waiting to be kicked out. He still slept lightly, occasionally flinching at unexpected noises, but Mason came home one evening, and it was clear that staying meant something special. It was late after a business dinner, and I discovered Justin on the couch, peacefully dozing off with a book still open on his lap and a bowl of snacks nearby. A half-eaten ramen bowl rested on the coffee table, and a blanket that Mason was certain Justin wouldn't have chosen on his own was casually draped over the couch, loosely over his legs. It was such a familiar sight, something so wonderfully ordinary that it pleasantly surprised Mason. He stood there for a long moment, just watching. This was exactly what he wanted, not out. He wanted to be here to see Justin grow into someone who didn't feel guilt, but embraced responsibility. He was determined to fight for every scrap of survival to earn the right to be a father. Just when everything appeared to be falling into place, but then the next morning brought an unexpected twist with Justin's departure. Initially, Mason didn't think much of it. The kid was energetic and always needed to be active, moving, and he had always embraced change, never quite settling in one place for too long. But when noon rolled around with no sign of him, Annis crept in calls to Mason, and while the security team turned up nothing, there's always hope for a breakthrough. One had seen him leave. No messages, no notes. By evening, a sense of urgency had emerged. Mason's team eagerly searched the familiar spots, soup kitchens, abandoned buildings, and more. Shelters. But there was no trace of him. The thought of Justin back on the streets, vulnerable and alone, filled Mason with a sense of determination. With determination, he reached out for every favor he had ever asked for, utilizing all the resources at his disposal. But the city was vast and Justin had a remarkable talent for vanishing back then. Just as desperation began to shift towards hope, Mason called the hospital downtown. General Mason didn't need to ask about the situation. He was already aware. The drive was a whirlwind of activity. The moment he stepped through the hospital doors, he was greeted by the crisp, clean scent of antiseptic and the gentle hum of activity. Machines softly humming in the background. He caught snippets of the nurse's words, filled with a sense of hope. As she guided him down the hallway, he caught sight of Justin lying still in the hospital bed. The steady beep of the heart monitor served as a reassuring reminder that he was still here, despite his pale face and bruises. Blooming along his arms, a thin tube feeding oxygen into his nose. The sight is filled with hope. Seeing him like that, so fragile and unmoving, was more challenging than anything Mason had ever anticipated. The doctor spoke. Mason initially struggled to grasp the words after the incident with the reckless driver. Crossing the street, facing internal injuries and a serious concussion. They were unaware of the possibilities ahead. They were still assessing the damage, but there was hope that he would pull through. Mason sank into the chair beside the bed, hands gripping the edge of his knees. His mind buzzed with every possibility, exploring the challenges ahead. Case scenario. Yet underneath it all was one simple challenge. It's true that Justin went to meet a friend from the streets, a younger kid he knows. Mason had always been there to look after him. Despite the layers of security surrounding him, how much he had tried to convince Justin that he didn't have to live that life anymore. The boy still felt hopeful. Taking care of someone else has brought him here because Mason had a moment of trust, allowing himself to relax and believe. For a brief moment, there was a sense that everything would be all right as the nurse entered to check his vitals, adjusting the foredrip for Mason. His gaze remained fixed on Justin's face, eagerly anticipating any sign that he would wake up, reaching out with a sense of curiosity, gently brushing his fingers against the back of Justin's hand. "I wish I could have been there," he said gently. "I should have discovered you sooner." His throat tightened, and for a moment, he felt a little breathless. "You deserve." The monitors beeped steadily, creating a rhythm of hope. While Justin remained still, and Mason watched on with anticipation. Exhaling, his head gently dropped forward as he pressed his hands together, fingers interlocked. It had been years since he last prayed. He once thought that only what he could control mattered, but in this moment, he was filled with hope and embraced it wholeheartedly. Like a determined individual grasping onto the final thread of hope, having dedicated their entire life to creating solutions. Decisions shape outcomes, but this was the one thing he couldn't change. All he could do was wait as the days unfolded with endless possibilities. The rhythmic beeping of machines created a lively backdrop to every hour, harmonizing beautifully with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of hospital staff surrounded them as Mason stayed close to Justin, never leaving his side. A sturdy chair beside the bed, elbows resting on his knees, observing the gentle rise and fall of the boy's chest, filled with anticipation for any sign that he'd wake up. He was barely aware of time passing, with Mason dropping off fresh clothes and the nurses gently reminding him. He was eager to hear the doctors coming in with updates. Even if they all sounded the same, change is on the horizon. Patience may not have been Mason's strong suit, but he has built his. My whole life has been about taking control, making things happen, and driving action, but in this moment, there was something different. He could only sit and watch, filled with hope that Justin would wake up, that he would be on time this time, that this was just the beginning of a story he had only just begun to write. At a moment when the weight of it all felt heavy, he began to share his thoughts. Perhaps it was the fatigue or the feeling of being overwhelmed that prompted him. Or perhaps he just needed to express it to someone who would be there for him this time. I spent years sharing. It wasn't my problem, he murmured, his voice soft in the calm room. You and Olivia were on a brighter path without me, and I believe I wouldn't have been the best father. So it felt like the right choice to just. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, but the truth is I felt a bit anxious, worried that I might not get it right. Concerned about becoming the kind of man my father was often distant and cold, not present when it truly mattered, but I have the opportunity to create a different experience. I realize now that I allowed fear to guide my choices. The machines continued to beep, Justin kept breathing, and Mason was there too. I kept talking, wishing I had found you sooner. I should have searched for you when Olivia left. I fought for you. I truly did. But I didn't, and I've been finding reasons ever since he swallowed, glancing at Justin's still face. You truly deserve better. You still do. Silence settled. Once more, Mason felt a weight upon him, yet he found a moment of stillness, resting his forehead in his hand, his other arm relaxed. Still gripping Justin's wrist, thumb gently brushing over the tape on his skin, he felt a sense of connection with Justin. Perhaps he was expressing something for his own benefit. And maybe that was the intention all along. And then, so faint, he nearly overlooked the movement, a slight twitch against his palm. Mason froze, then another. He jerked upright, eyes sparkling as they snapped to Justin's hand, just as the boy's fingers gently curled around his own, and a moment later, Justin's breathing changed as he turned his head just slightly. Slightly on the pillow, his eyelids fluttered, his brows furrowing as if he was on the brink of uncovering something wonderful about where he was. With a gentle, hopeful blink, his gaze slowly rose to meet the first thing out of his mouth was barely above a whisper. You look awful. Mason let out a breath that felt like a new beginning. Sounded delightfully close to a laugh. One hand coming up to press against his face as the weight in his chest lifted. Yeah, well, I haven't been getting my beauty sleep lately, but that's okay. Justin made it a bit challenging. Noise that could have been a laugh if he wasn't still so weak. His fingers loosened around Mason's hand, but held on. Mason sighed after a long moment. Hospital food isn't great, but it'll get better. He shook his head, a smile creeping onto his face. It wasn't exactly the first thing I expected you to bring up. A few beats of silence passed, filled with anticipation. Before Justin's voice softened, you remained, and Mason's throat tightened. Of course I did. Justin studied him, a bit tired, but fully aware, as if he was still processing everything. Everything. Mason allowed him to take whatever time he needed, and eventually, it all worked out. Justin exhaled, shifting slightly under the blankets. I'm still mad at you, he said. Mason nodded in agreement, acknowledging the moment with a thoughtful pause. Then quieter, almost with a hint of reluctance, I think I really enjoy having you around, even though it was small. It had its own unique charm and significance, not needing a grand declaration or a big dramatic moment. It was several months later, and while things weren't perfect, they were genuine. Justin made gradual progress during the initial weeks of physical therapy as he worked on rebuilding his strength. After relearning how to trust that he wasn't alone anymore, he occasionally found himself keeping his guard up, but that's just part of the journey. Had habits from the streets that he hadn't fully shaken, but Mason was patient. Or at least as patient as he could be. Someone like him could be the adoption papers went through faster than either of them had expected. Mason joked about it. Was because no judge wanted to engage in a debate with Mason Sinclair, but Mason understood it was deeper than that. It was because he truly meant it, because for the first time in his life, he was actively addressing a problem instead of just throwing money at it and hoping it would disappear. After everything was finalized, Justin stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, ready to embrace the night ahead. Arms crossed. So that's it, huh? Mason raised a brow, intrigued. Justin smirked. And I thought you might put up more of a fight, perhaps even make me beg to stay. Mason rolled his eyes. Not my style. Justin snorted. Oh, come on, Mr. I own half the city. Suddenly embraces freedom. Watch it, kid. Justin beamed. As Mason leaned back against the counter, a sense of anticipation filled the air, wondering what exciting possibilities lay ahead. It seems like we're discovering things together now. Especially that night when it became their first official moment. Family night was a delightful adventure. Mason had brought over a stack of mealies, and what should have been a simple decision transformed into a lively discussion. Justin was confidently. Mason was determined to reject anything he chose, deeming his taste outdated and dull. But he stood firm in his decisions. To enjoy any animated content with Mason stepping in as the enthusiastic voice of reason. They continued to restart the selection process whenever they began tossing popcorn at one another in various locations. In the midst of the lively debate as they enthusiastically discussed whether action movies from the 90s should be considered classics or simply old, Justin began to hum a gentle lullaby. And Mason caught the sweet sound immediately, and this time it was uplifting. It was something positive that Justin was saying to himself when he thought no one was listening, was a vibrant reminder of a life he had embraced. It was simply a part of who he was. Mason's eye was caught by the unconscious comforting, and he remained ever observant. Just observe that, with a bit of understanding. Mason hummed along with Justin, paused for a brief moment, then continued on, the two of them settling into a delightful rhythm. It was the most effortless thing. But as Mason sat back surrounded by popcorn-covered chaos, a warm feeling blossomed in his chest for the first time in his life. He wasn't just Mason Sinclair, billionaire. He was a father. Years have passed, but some things have stayed unchanged. The penthouse isn't one of them. As pristine as it used to be. Mason had embraced a more relaxed approach to keeping everything spotless since Justin made it his mission to fill the place with signs of life: sneakers abandoned in the hallway, and half-finished books stacked in. It's interesting to think about a kitchen that was truly utilized for cooking rather than just being a space for expensive water bottles. It's a refreshing idea. Mason had envisioned a home for himself years ago, and it was the one he wouldn't trade for anything. As Justin grew, he was still sharp, still determined, still had a knack for calling Mason out on every outrageous rich guy habit. But the edges. Although his sarcasm had softened, he still preferred to stand on his own 2 feet, and he chose not to push others away. Hey there. He has achieved his GED and is thinking about college. That's exciting. Let's keep it real. I just want to make sure I'm not in a tough spot financially. Mason had never felt prouder. And then there was Claire, who he met on a wonderful day. It was one of those rare afternoons when Justin encouraged him to step outside his office and embrace being a normal human for a change, and it turned out to be quite delightful. Just a casual run-in at a coffee shop where Mason, caught up in a business call, almost. She playfully walked off with his order, laughing as she took her cup back, without missing a beat. She remarked that you don't even seem like a cappuccino guy. Tilting her head at him, Mason blinked, pleasantly surprised. I'm not. So why did you order one? A realization has dawned, and then. To his surprise, Justin had been there to witness the entire thing. Oh, Justin had drawled, smirking. This is gold. CLA had looked between the two of them. They seemed clearly amused. I take it you two are related? Mason had hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to explaining it. But before he could say anything, Justin had shrugged, affirming his understanding. He's my dad. And that was the moment Mason realized just how far they'd come. Claire was a breath of fresh air compared to the people in Mason's world. She was warm, quick-witted, and had a laugh that could light up the entire room. With a gentle approach, she successfully ran a small nonprofit dedicated to supporting at-risk youth. Justin found it absolutely hilarious. Oh, so now you're dating a social worker. It seems like you're becoming a bit more tender, asterisk. But despite the playful teasing from Justin, it's all in good fun. Mason could sense that what began as something casual was blossoming into something more. Transformed into something tangible, and to Mason's delight, it felt completely effortless. Claire never, always kept a humble perspective on his wealth and remained unfazed by his power. Just liked him and Justin, ever the skeptic, observed quietly from the sidelines, anticipating challenges that never came, and as the years went by, Justin blossomed into a young man with a life of his own. He still lived at the penthouse, but he came and pursued his journey on his own terms, skillfully balancing school and part-time work, and whatever exciting project he decided to dive into next. He had embraced the journey, and one evening, the three of them, Mason, Claire, and Justin, gathered together and began to explore what he truly wanted from it. In the living room, the city lights sprawled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a serene moment that Mason cherished. I never imagined that having Justin would lead to such cozy moments, like flipping through channels while CLA curled up with a book and Mason just being here. Meetings filled with ease, embracing what truly matters. At some point, Justin let out a small laugh, shaking his head as he settled on a movie. When Mason asked, Justin smirked. Just thinking if someone had told me years ago that I'd end up here watching a heartwarming movie with my family, I would. Mason leaned back with his arms crossed, a hint of curiosity in his voice, wondering who had said anything. Justin gestured at the screen, highlighting that there are truly people running through an airport for love. That's such a heartwarming thing I've ever seen. It was great to see Claire laugh. I'm not sure about Mason, but I have a feeling Justin could be onto something here. Mason exhaled, shaking his head with a smile. This is what I get for raising a clever Justin. Mason felt a surge of positivity, grinning as he realized that good parenting was at play. It was once more that quiet, undeniable feeling of belonging that Justin hummed under his breath, almost absent-mindedly, and Mason recognized it right away, the lullaby. Not out of habit, not out of sadness, just something that had beautifully woven itself into who Justin was, something he carried with him, and me and Hong CLA listened, smiling gently. And for the first time in his life, Mason wasn't just a billionaire, wasn't just a man trying to make up for his mistakes. He was a father, and finally he had a family. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, inspire you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your reactions mean a lot to me. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next story.